Well, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Brandon Bretl, who was born and raised in Wisconsin and just got back from there, actually. So after graduating college with a degree in fine arts and chemistry, he taught English in Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt for about 3 years. Afterwards, he moved to rural Kansas and began working as a math and science teacher. And these experiences in teaching radically different cultural contexts encouraged him to pursue a career in educational research. And in 2020, he completed his PhD in educational psychology at the University of Kansas. He's now a professor here at UT Tyler, and he teaches and conducts research at the intersections of social and political psychology, adolescent development, and science education. He's a supporter of CASA and is very passionate about our organization. So he is here today to talk about adverse childhood experiences. So please help me welcome Dr. Brandon Bretl. Screen share.
All right, great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Jared. Yes, yeah, good introduction. Thanks, Jared. Real quick about what we'll talk about today, about me, some theory, and we'll get into ACEs then, and then maybe some practical advice. So real quick about me, as Jared said, I'm an assistant professor. I'm in the College of Education Psychology, and I just want to highlight what my specialization is, and then maybe kind of where I'm weak in terms of what I'm talking about here. And I'm really hoping that you all can fill me in a bit. So I'm hoping this can be a bit interactive. You can share some of your experiences with me and make it more practical. Because really what I do is focused on adolescent social development and the social context. So I do stuff related to, for example, what it means to grow up in maybe a more conservative or liberal environment and how that influences their development and their beliefs and things like that. So really even thinking of people as individuals, I don't really do that much in my research. And I really only think about groups and how groups function and things like that. Whereas I think much more practical for you all working with individuals, you're going to have to take this theory now and think about how it applies to individuals. So just to give you a little heads up, it's probably going to be a lot of kind of theory where I'm coming from in this. But really, you probably have a lot more to offer in terms of practical advice, how that would relate to what you're doing with individuals. The picture here, I just got back from Wisconsin, so I'm married. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old daughter. We're on the right there. My grandparents are in the middle here. They just celebrated their 70th wedding anniversary. So that's why I was in Wisconsin. So 70 years married, their 90th birthdays. We all got together the last time that the extended family got together was 10 years ago for their 60th. So I got to see all of my cousins again. We had maybe a little over 50 people. And it was really beautiful. At the same time, it was nice, and that's where I come from. Also related to that, I sometimes think about what right do I have to talk about ACEs or these childhood, because my life, my upbringing, my childhood was pretty much as good as it gets. There's difficult things, but like I said, it was pretty much as good as it gets. So that's where I'm coming from. I don't have a lot of, firsthand experience either, which is also, again, why I'm hoping that some of you can share some of your experiences, give me some stuff to work with too. Okay. So to start with, in talking about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, I want to start with a theoretical foundation to build on. And I'd like to start with attachment theory and talk a little bit about sea turtles, first of all. So this sea turtle, from the time it's born, it's on its own. No one's helping it. And it's going to be one of a couple dozen that are born, and a few of them are going to survive. Its life is one big adverse experience. It's on its own, and that's the way it is. Other animals, that's not the case. So other animals, other species require a caregiver to survive. So if a duckling gets separated it's more or less done for. That's the end of that. It really requires a caregiver in a minimal sense. There isn't much that the duck can do other than protection and staying together as a group. But that's a necessity for ducklings. Go to mammals, then we have these extended periods of caregiving that are required just to survive. And there are other things that are needed to thrive. But just to survive, we require a caregiver from the time we're born for many, many years. And that's the foundation of attachment theory. The idea, the attachment theory is that we have psychological biases that we're born with, that we're pre-programmed. Our brain and body and physiology is pre-programmed to attach to a caregiver. And if we don't have that, it causes a lot of dysfunction in humans. One of the interesting things about attachment theory is that the way that we attach to caregivers as children, certain aspects of that reemerge in adolescence in very predictable ways. So the way that our caregiving relationships were in childhood, we will often bring those things into our adolescent relationships. So when we look at adolescence, we're looking at starting to detach from primary caregivers and form attachments with romantic partners and friends and things like that. We're going to use the modeling that we received as children and bring that into those relationships. So it's relatively uncommon for adolescents, young adults to have healthy relationships if they've come from dysfunctional environments. So in general, children go through these stages of development. This is for very young children, all within the first year of development. We'll have a pre-attachment phase where we have no real awareness of who's holding us or what's going on. There will be certain physiological responses to sounds and smells that are familiar. So we'll, recognize the sounds that our parents make even from the time that we were in the womb and things like that. Going to 6 to 7 months, we'll start showing a preference for a primary or secondary caregiver. By 7 months, strong attachment to one specific caregiver. And then after 10 months onward, start developing attachment bonds with multiple caregivers and start to differentiate those relationships that, mom is this way, dad is this way. I can start behaving, this will fly with mom, this will not fly with dad, and those different types of relationships. And those different types of relationships are very important too. One thing that's important about this is that those primary attachment figures can be anybody. So there are certain, again, very young especially, certain physiological things that we could say mother is best, that a mom is going to be better than anyone else at being able to provide that. But in terms of the emotional development and even the physiological stuff, having a primary caregiver, it can be anybody, if they're providing the needs of the child. So single father, if the grandparents are taking care of the child, 2 dads, all of that is going to be just as beneficial as any other type of situation, so long as the child's needs are being met socially, emotionally, physically, things like that. Okay, so now we're going to get even deeper into some theory stuff here. And I've got a question for you. What was the greatest threat to our ancestors' reproductive success? So if we're going to look at this from an evolutionary point of view, evolution would say that all of that we are today is a product of what was reproductively fitter throughout our evolutionary history. So if there was something about you that made you more likely to reproduce and pass on those traits or genes to the next generation, those genes and traits would be passed on to the next generation. So my question is, so what was the greatest threat from, caveman times to now? I would say it's still the same threat. What would be the greatest threat to our ancestors' reproductive success and ours right now?
Early death?
Early death, yeah, definitely. That's one, yeah. Oops. Any other thoughts?
Having enough children?
Not having enough children, not having a big enough support network to do that, yeah. A lot of times I get things like famine or disease, starvation, things like that. All of those are gonna be. However, I would argue that the greatest threat is, oh, my next slide here, is ostracism. So the greatest threat to our reproductive success from caveman times to now, including now, is ostracism from the in-group, whatever that in-group is. So if we're ostracized from our family, if we're ostracized from our community, ostracized from our any social group, that is going to be the greatest threat to our reproductive success. From that, we would predict that we have very strong psychological biases, innate psychological biases, to keep us part of our in-group. And we'll go to really extreme lengths to not be ostracized. And when we are ostracized, that has a physiological effect as well. So real quick, related to children and adolescents, family and friendships are really central to development. That's nothing new. I mean, anybody who doesn't know that, I don't know where you've been, but it's also important that it can be traumatic to be out of the family or friend group. So as you know, in children, it's going to be family. As we go into adolescence, it's really going to be friends. By the time a child is 12 years old, the parents don't really have any real meaningful influence on their development. It really is children for the most part. Or their peers is going to be the real major predictor of a lot of the outcomes. So ostracism, traumatic. This is also the origin of peer pressure. So we can have strong impulses to conform to peers, engage in risky behavior, and do that to remain in the in-group. Related to that, when we talk about that ostracism, one of the interesting things about us as individuals is that our physiology as well is in a way set up to be a part of a group. And there are certain things about our physiology that we will actually harm ourselves in preservation of the group. So I'll give you a few examples. For example, if people who are diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, there's a predictable curve related to the amount of shame they feel related to the disease and their decline in T cell count, their immune system response. So the more shame they feel about the disease, the more rapid their body will essentially start to destroy itself. So this all fits into this idea of group preservation and being part of the group. And one of the things that is related to that is the ability to make a group stronger by ostracizing an individual. So one of the fastest ways to make a group stronger is to get rid of somebody. I mean, you can do that relatively immediately. And as humans, we do that in complex ways. It's not always physical ostracism. It can often be, emotional ostracism or social ostracism. And that can be done without any sort of physical aspect. So related to that, the psychological constructs and physiologically related to that are really related to shame and guilt. So when we have that sense of ostracism or being pushed out, that leads to shame. And shame is really a feeling that's directed at the self. It's something's wrong with me. And children, when they're experiencing that, will internalize that as shame. And that goes along with when we talk, we'll get to ACEs, the abuse, so physical, sexual abuse. It's very hard for children to think of adults as doing anything wrong. So often it's twisted to being there's something wrong with me. There must be something wrong with me. And as I said, shame is associated with certain physiological responses in the body. The body will actually change. It will harm the body. Whereas guilt is directed at the behavior. So it's feelings that, okay, I did this thing that's wrong. I need to repair some sort of relationship. So in general, people who are prone to feeling guilty, we're all born with different personality traits. If we're born to feeling guilty, we're more prone to feeling guilty, you're going to have better outcomes in life. It'll be associated with pro-social outcomes because that feeling of guilt is a negative feeling, but what it's telling you is that something's not right in a social relationship and you need to take a proactive step to fix that relationship. Again, where shame is, there's something wrong with me. I'm actually defective. I'm actually not worthy. There's something wrong. So again, shame is an ostracizing mechanism. It's a way that we can ostracize people without actually physically ostracizing them. There are physiological effects. It's going to change the body and brain. It's going to be correlated with internalizing symptoms, things like depression. And it's also correlated with physical and sexual abuse. So it's often caused by that, but then it can also increase your chances for that. Yeah, and that's just related to self-esteem, self-respect, and the types of situations that different people might find themselves in. Guilt, on the other hand, pro-social. You're gonna if you're prone to feeling guilt, you're gonna have better social relationships. It's motivation to repair those relationships. It's correlated with secure attachments. So that's something that in early childhood, you go through this phase where you start trying to piece out shame and guilt. You get in trouble for doing something. Is it because there's something wrong with you, or is it because you just did something wrong? You got to fix it. You got to learn from it, things like that. So parents play a really big role in a child's ability to feel shame-free guilt. Can you admit that you were in the wrong without believing there's something wrong with you? And can you take the steps that are necessary to repair that relationship? And then, so again, positive outcomes. That's going to be correlated with positive outcomes in general. Probably a good place to stop and see if there's any questions, comments, concerns about that.
I do.
Yeah.
So in terms of, like some of the kids that we're advocating for, and like say we were to notice that there was more shame present than guilt. I guess, and that's the spirit of this whole presentation, bad destructive experiences. But in your opinion, like what are some like ways to, I don't want to say combat that, but acknowledge that, I guess.
Yeah. I think, well, at the end, I have some like practical advice that's related to that. But for now, I think a few things to consider. One, I can't imagine again, I haven't been an advocate, so I'm a bit limited in my ability to comment on that. But I can't imagine having a child that's not experiencing shame. And it's going to be at different levels. Sometimes it's going to be very apparent and on the surface. I mean, they'll actually tell you. I mean, if they're thinking of committing suicide and stuff like that, that's a good indicator that they believe there's something not right with them. But again, I can't imagine a child that's not in some way feeling that sense of shame, that there's something wrong with me. So I think back to your question, real quick, just recognizing that, being aware of that, and that if you're not taking proactive steps to address that with those children, that will be harmful. Yeah.
And we do have something in the shadows.
Yeah.
Sorry. So somebody said that they did notice that the teenager they're advocating for does have tendencies to feel shame rather than guilt. And do you feel like that's more common with any age demographic to kind of internalize shame over guilt, or is it kind of across the board the same for ages?
That's a really good question. So there is an early childhood period, and it's going to be right when you're really just starting to modify behavior. So for example, my youngest is 2.5. She's just going through that experience. So right now, whenever I correct her, she feels shame right away. And it breaks my heart because she'll, like, you see it in her. She cries, and it's just this, she feels like, oh my God, like I thought you loved me, how can you take mom's makeup away from me? I thought, so it's a process that is going to be immediately in that process of affirming, I love you, care about you, this is what you can't do, and things like that. So it's something that, again, now that I'm thinking about it, it's something that takes so much work on my part. As soon as you start creating dysfunction in the family, and if a kid is not having that regular and consistent experience of being able to make mistakes and still feel loved, they're going to have deficits in that area. So that's that early childhood, and then it's going to reemerge again in adolescence when they start building their identity and thinking about who they are and what they are. That'll be so definitely yes. There's going to be an adolescent period where you would expect to see this more prominently. Yeah.
So in a reasonably healthy functioning family, would it be more of a personality issue with children to say that some are more prone to shame rather than more prone to reacting the way that you just described than other children who might easily fall into guilty, sorry, I wrote on the wall, but I shouldn't have done that. Is that an individual thing?
Absolutely, yeah. And all of these things too, when we're thinking about our innate proneness to feel shame or guilt, or even our ability to do it, there are examples where there's that complete lack of ability so psychopathy. So psychopaths actually, it's not so much there's actually a physical difference in their brain that wiring is not present. So that ability is something that we've developed over millions of years really in our evolutionary past to be able to feel this way and things like that. So definitely individual, and that's something to be aware of with these children as well, that they're going to be born with their individual genetic makeup and personality traits. And there will definitely be some who are more shame prone or guilt prone. And the work of the parent or the educator or anybody in their life is to really help them separate those things, to that ability to feel shame-free guilt. Shame is never good. It's never a good experience, other than it could be good for the group. Like it could be good for the group if there's somebody who's not participating in the way they should, to get them out. Whereas guilt and that ability to feel shame-free guilt, something we need to practice. It's something that takes time. Appreciate the questions. Yeah.
What about the ones that technically don't show either? It's someone else's guilt, not theirs.
I think, one thing, there will be issues of psychopathy in children as well. And a lot of that is going to be a product of environment. There's real harsh environments and challenging things that can have a dulling effect on these abilities. They don't have the bandwidth or ability to feel these. Is that kind of what you're getting at? So there's just kind of a lack of that?
They don't basically show a sense of shame no matter what they do or what they say. But by the same token, they don't take any responsibility for their behavior. It's someone else did it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think my guess is that's a bit of a self-preservation mechanism, because the alternative would be feeling a lot of shame. And so they've kind of blocked that maybe. And then from there, I think it's just another area of developing that sense of personal responsibility. And it's just, I don't think from here there's a direct connection to it, but I think it's in other ways that sense of personal responsibility needs to be built in that. And so what age group are you thinking when that?
What did you say?
What age group? Are you thinking of a specific age group?
Teenagers.
Or teenagers? I think that's actually even in relatively functional families and things like that, that's a process that most people go through. You kind of get to that point in your life where, okay, I can either blame my parents or I can live my life, because no one's parents are perfect. So I think that's just a kind of a natural process as well. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the
Yeah,
question, but yeah.
That was my thinking too,
Yeah.
that the tools to help them change that are
Yeah.
very, very difficult.
Right, right. Yeah, and in terms of I'm trying to think what I would do. I mean, a lot of it is just talking through it, talking through it, how they feel, why they feel that way, and being able to maybe offer some practical advice and, little by little getting them to take those steps to personal responsibility and things like that.
So in all three examples of shame, or the inability to have needed.
Yeah.
Psychopathic example.
Yeah.
Did you say it's always a learned behavior or coping mechanism and there's no way genetic, having any kind of genetic link?
I think a little bit of both. Yeah. So for the most part, just you could have genetic condition where you actually don't have this ability. So, and that's not the end of the world. So there are, in the right environment, people on the autism spectrum, oftentimes, just it could be a complete lack of empathy. They don't have the neural circuitry to feel what another person is feeling. In the right environment, there can be interventions that can be done to get them close enough where they're kind of mimicking in social environments what that is like. And it'll, so they can live a good life. So I think, yeah, it's that on the one hand, you have the genetic just predisposition that is the ability to learn and develop in what would be the typical way. And if you have that, but the environment doesn't foster it through education and things like that, then you're going to have a deficiency. And at the same time, you could be born without that ability, but with the right interventions, you could get something that's similar and close. And that was my work. I worked with teenagers. It was a gifted and talented program, but we had, a lot on the autism spectrum in that. And so a lot of experience with that, those target interventions to okay, when you're with someone, you have to look in their eyes and what do you think they're feeling right now? Or how does that make them feel and things like that. Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you have this slide up and I'm thinking, man, so-and-so needs to see this here, and what you're talking about here, it helps us as individuals, it helps us as parents, as grandparents, and also CASA volunteers.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about the kids I have right now, and I'm thinking, like I got a kid who I don't think he feels shame or guilt. He just doesn't care.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's 15.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm thinking, and I know that there was some issues early in his childhood that probably caused that.
Yeah.
But this is really good stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, there's a saying that the psychologists study until they cure themselves and then they do consulting. So but this is really I think this is important stuff. Being aware of that. On the same hand, I'm not a counseling psychologist, so I really don't, again, individual level, I'm very lacking in practical advice, unfortunately, but as far as I can go is just recommending getting professional help sooner than, the sooner you can do it. And it's really, there's no shame in that, I think as a society, we're over that now. I mean, literally everyone I know has a therapist. It's just, and if you're not, you're missing out on just something that's a part of personal growth and development that could be good. Okay. Any other, we'll just, again, before we go into ACEs, we'll just do a little bit on brains, neurons, and learning. So, real quick, this is just for fun. We have 86 to 100 billion neurons. A neuron can have thousands of connections, so synapses. So we see the illustrations in textbooks where it's maybe like 5 or 6, connections between neurons, but a single neuron can have thousands of connections. That leads to 150 trillion neocortical synapses. So that outer wrinkled cortex of your brain has, somewhere around 150 trillion connections. A 3-month fetus, so the nerve cells proliferate at a rate of about 15 million per hour. And at that rate, so it takes about 277 days to get to 100 billion. And this, I'm giving you this information to clear up what is often a major misconception about learning and brain development in general. So our brains produce an overabundance of connections, those synapses, those connections. So in infancy and late childhood, we produce an overabundance, so more connections than we need. And then synaptic pruning, so the removal of those connections, peaks during early childhood and then again in adolescence. And that can be at rates of up to 30,000 per second. So you can have pretty, extended periods of weeks, months, where you're losing 30,000 connections per second. And that sounds like too much, but if you know how much a trillion is, you'd understand that that can take a long time. So what really happens is that, the myth is that learning is about making new neural connections. The vast majority of our learning and development is the process of maintaining synaptic connections while the unused ones are being pruned. So while those are being taken away, so use it or lose it. So in that early childhood period and that adolescent period, our bodies are just naturally removing connections. The only ones that are staying are the ones that we've been using. So when we're talking about learning and development, it's that process of using those connections in different and varied environments. More enriching environments, the more connections we're going to keep. And it's a use it or lose it period. This is a one chance shot for our development. Once those synapses are gone, it takes a lot to make a new connection. It's much more efficient to just get rid of connections. So what that does, it creates these experience expectant states in our development. So we as humans go through these two experience expectant states, two main ones at least. And from 0 to 4, it's language development. And that's fostered by those secure attachments. And that relates to emotional development as well. But the real thing that happens from 0 to 4 is language development. So one of the biggest predictors of all future success will be how many words the child heard between 0 and 4 years old. So, and when we look at like correlations between outcomes and poverty and things like that, a lot of it goes back to just how much that child's been talked to. So if you're growing up in poverty, if both of your parents are working full time, you're in daycare with you're just not talked to a lot. You don't hear a lot of words. So the most important thing there is just a lot of words, a lot of talking and hearing those. Again, then the second stage during puberty, it's really a time for social, emotional, and cognitive integration. So we have in the brain, we have different, what are like modules, or different parts of the brain, they do different things. We have our, cognitive stuff that's really focused in the frontal lobes. That's where we're doing our planning and thinking, things like that. We have emotional systems, which are, below the cortex, like the amygdala and things like that. And then we have social processing systems in like the temporal and parietal lobes that are going to be responsible for processing social information. Right now, my brain's going crazy, reading your faces, doing all this behind the scenes. Like I'm not consciously thinking about it, but I'm getting a lot of information about whether you're bored, whether you're interested, all these things that I'm then integrating into my own emotional state, and then cognitively thinking about how I might adapt in that situation. So most of us, in any situation, this stuff is going on, but it was during puberty that we really put those pieces together. That when we see something or feel something, and then being able to think about it and modify our behaviors based on that. So we're talking about experience expectant states. If we were to say 0 to 4, early childhood, it's language development. The next big one is social, emotional, cognitive integration during adolescence. And again, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus storing and retrieving memories. And then the amygdala is going to be a major emotional center that then activates other emotional areas. So now we're going to start getting into ACEs stuff. So when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, it's all in the name, adverse. It's a harmful childhood experience, something that is adverse. And what, on a physiological level, that'll release the stress hormone cortisol. And what cortisol does, it's correlated with, decreased size and function of the prefrontal cortex, so that inability to plan ahead, make good decisions, things like that. The hippocampus, there'll be fewer connections. There'll be functional changes, so just difficulty with memory in general, contextualizing new situations. So a lot of what we do, every situation we're in is actually novel. None of us have ever been in this exact situation before. We've been in a lot of situations similar to this, so we know what. But in a high stress environment, consistent high stress environment, that ability will be stunted. And then the amygdala, same thing, structural changes, functional changes. For example, hyperactive stress response, things like that. Similar to like post-traumatic stress disorder, that's going to be caused of that. So within that context, really three types of stress. We have positive stress. So it's just that energizing, help us focus on important tasks. It's some sort of physiological arousal that tells us this is important and we need to focus on it. There's tolerable stress. So, it could be toxic without the proper conditions and support. So, tolerable stress is that stress that could be over the limit of what would be safe, but because of our social situation, our social context, the family and friend support that we have, we can manage it. And then there's toxic stress. So that is just intense and chronic activation of the stress response system. And that's your sympathetic nervous system. So you activate that gets you in that fight or flight mode, releases cortisol, and it's going to have all those negative effects when it is chronic. And this is the basis of ACEs, and the ACEs research is this chronic stress that influences brain development. Any quick questions about that could be cleared up? Because I kind of want to just tie this right into ACEs then. So a little history on it. So this is really all from a study done in 1998. Since then, there have been a lot of other studies, but the original just looked at 17,000 adults, long-term health outcomes, and their responses on this ACEs survey, Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. And they correlated those with outcomes. So, for example, if these adults indicated having 4 or more ACEs, they were 2 to 3 times greater risk for heart disease and cancer, 10 to 12 times greater risk for intravenous drug use, 32 times more likely to experience learning or behavioral challenges at school. And then if you had 6 or more ACEs, you had a shortened life expectancy by about 20 years. So the ACEs research is all coming from medical policy research and looking at this and how this stuff influences health outcomes long term. So these are the ACEs that are recognized. So we have abuse, so that can be physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. Neglect, physical or emotional neglect. And then household dysfunction. So mental illness, an incarcerated relative, mother treated violently, substance abuse, divorce. These would all be considered ACEs. So you take a survey, the number of these that you have is directly correlated with long-term health outcomes.
Could you go back to the other slide
Mhm.
and see?
This one here?
Yeah. So it was 32 times more likely to experience learning and behavioral challenges at school.
Yep. So those ACEs then translate into behavioral realities. So a lack of physical activity, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, missed work, severe obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, broken bones. All those things, increased risk factors for shortened lifespan and that are directly correlated with adverse childhood experiences. So the logic for how all of this ties together, we have generational embodiment, historical trauma. The reality is, so for example, growing up Black in America is just very different than growing up white. And that's the way it is. And there are historical reasons for that. So to not recognize that, we're missing a huge, aspect of that person's life. So that's important. So then from there, we have the current social conditions, the local context. Within that, we can have adverse childhood experiences. Those adverse childhood experiences through increased cortisol levels and other stress response things will hinder neural development. So we'll have disrupted neural development. That will then lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, leads to the adoption of health risk behaviors, higher risk behaviors, increased risk of disease, disability, and social problems, and then early death. And looking here, healthy development, again, build this foundation of secure attachment bonds in childhood, develop those mechanisms of stress management and self-regulation, which would include things like shame and shame-free guilt, things like that. School readiness, so just self-awareness, social awareness, relationship skills, executive functions, build on that, certain things that we know work well, growth mindset, self-efficacy, sense of belonging, relevance of school, perseverance, then resilience, agency, academic tenacity, and then built on that, self-direction, curiosity, and then civic identity. So I guess in my mind, these are things that you would maybe think about as you're advocating, where maybe these blocks are weak or how you maximize, positive things in that child's life.
So is that arrow on the right? Is that time? Is that age? What is that?
I think just like the direction of this stuff, it's almost like a Maslow's type thing. Like, so for example, if you, to really fully develop each one, you need to have that foundation. So I think it's just a matter of, moving up. Yeah. Do you have any other questions, comments, concerns about that, or maybe ways that it relates practically to what you're doing?
I am wondering if you could touch more about the ways that it practically correlate with like being a CASA advocate.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm relying on you all for.
I know that's right.
I do have a slide on it. But yeah.
Right now, while we're getting ready for school, I see school several times in this.
Yeah.
Do you have any, again, practical advice on knowing that we're dealing with children with ACEs?
Mm-hmm.
How can we prepare them right now to get ready to go to school?
It's a good question. I think one, it'll be different for different age groups, but I think in looking, let's start with children. Children too, there's certain things that we just can't really help with. If they didn't have those secure attachment bonds in childhood, there's not much we can do. We can be a positive role model in their life and help in some ways, but there's only so much. So really, if we just kind of jump ahead then to that school readiness piece, I think fostering those, self-awareness, social awareness, and relationship skills and executive functions. So school itself, especially public school, it's kind of a jungle. I mean, you're thrown to the wolves in school. I mean, kids are bullied and it's tough. All we have to do is kind of think back to when we were kids, not having the right sneakers is a big deal. And it doesn't matter that it's not really a big deal. It feels like a big deal. So it is for them. So I think just recognizing that they're kind of getting thrown into this environment, that their peer relationships are going to be more important than what you do for them or even their parents do for them. And that's going to be more and more as we get into adolescence, especially. So by the time they're teenagers, they're, they can look to you as a role model and things like that, but they're going to be much more concerned with what their friends think. So maybe directing your interventions and your talking with them at that level, supporting them in the skills they're going to need to make good friends and be a good friend. And any of those things related to self-awareness, social awareness, and relationship skills might go a long way in that regard. Yeah, I think that the hardest part is really just how limited we might be as an advocate. We're just one piece in their lives. A lot could be done, but to really address everything that somebody's going to need, it's going to take the school to be aware of what's going on, and they're going to have special interventions and things like that too. Does that answer? Is that yeah? Do you have a?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the problem that we have
Mhm.
is that by the time we get these kids, they've got all the aces.
Right, yeah,
And I even had a teacher
yeah.
bully my kid indirectly by asking me, what
Mhm.
did they do to get put in foster care?
Yeah.
So it's not just the kids
Yeah.
we have to work with, it's the whole system because people don't get it.
That's a really good point. Yeah, and I think it comes back because they're going to be, even those teachers who aren't explicitly doing that, they often will, just kind of in very, this is something because I teach teachers at university, so it's that's really what I'm focused on. But if those teachers aren't consciously aware of their own biases, they will be modeling those for the children. And children are so sensitive to how the teacher is treating other kids. So I give the example, because again, I think kind of in like large groups, if you were to give 500 teachers and 500 teachers this same situation where it was like you have a student whose parents are both medical doctors, she's always done really well, and she did really bad on a test, but your policy is no retakes. You've got this other kid who's coming from poverty, broken home, not popular. They fail a test and they're gonna ask for a retake. Who's more likely to be given the retake? And it's like in any individual, we would hope we'd be fair. But if let's say you do 500 teachers in one, 500 teachers in one, I could pretty much guarantee that more teachers are going to give that other student. And so that's one way. And then two, it just in so many subtle ways, they're going to be modeling that behavior. So the only thing I can think really is just kind of that focused on them, making them aware of themselves and who they are, and any practical advice about being in those social environments, just how to advocate for yourself, how to stand up for yourself. And I think a lot of it just gets down to getting down to, their beliefs about themselves, like getting them to believe that you're okay, you are who you're supposed to be, that, you're, it's a tough situation, but that's how I would address it, trying to really kind of build them up and then some practical skills. Any other things related to that? Okay, real quick, just because some of these things might not be things you think about. So as you said, by the time you're working with them, they're going to have had multiple ACEs, just by definition. And at the same time, it makes them more susceptible or increases their chances of experiencing more in the future. So especially different types of abuse. So physical abuse, physical neglect, sexual abuse, just some physical indicators to be aware of. And the way I explain this to my teachers is that because they're in situations where they have their students and they might find themselves in a mandatory reporting situation. So it's hard to, what you really have to do in those situations is turn your feelings into concrete and objective facts. So keeping a record of these things and then, going through the appropriate channels to take care of it. And with my teachers, I try to stress that it's not your job to get involved. Too often teachers get too involved and they take on a greater load than they can really take on and then end up causing more harm than good. I'm sure you guys are all aware of this, but it's just little things like, you suspect a kid is getting hit or something. The teacher then contacts the parents about that. Now the kid's really going to get hit because they know they told the teacher, things like that. So it's just really important to know where you fit in the system and, do what you can without trying to do more that could then be harmful. But just, a few things that, those physical indicators, behavioral indicators, you start looking for these, you start checking things off and they start having multiple that, be aware that could be a strong indicator of abuse. Okay, what Jared has been waiting for. Here we go. So what do we do? What can we do? I think number one, be a positive role model. So you just have to be thinking about how you're presenting yourself to these children and being a positive role model. Really important, model caring and respectful behavior. So the way that you talk to them is going to be so important. And they literally might have not seen it. They might have not seen somebody, appropriate conflict resolution or things like that. So just the ability to see somebody who handles things in a way that is positive and good. So modeling that caring and respectful behavior. This is maybe more for teachers, but setting clear limits. I think this is probably relevant for some of you as well. So setting clear limits and boundaries, and not trying to be something that you're not. I think maybe the most important thing, if we're going to talk about it in the context of shame and guilt, show that you like who they are. So trauma can lead to shame, eye contact, relax your posture, smile at them, any chance you can get to say, I like who you are. I think you're fine. I think you're good. All of those things, I think, can go a long way. So good teachers, they care, they maintain authority and motivate. And this maybe goes along the lines of what you were asking too, is how to maybe influence that motivation factor. Like how do we get children and youth to see why they should do these things? And I think as humans, we're actually very good at, and this is one of the reasons I think people struggle in school so much, is that a lot of it is meaningless. A lot of the time spent in school is meaningless. And kids aren't wrong, when they're not engaged and motivated to do that stuff. So I think finding ways to create authentic motivation in that child to take responsibility for their lives and any chance that they can get those experiences of not being able to do something to working for an extended period of time and then being able to do it, if that makes sense. So it's that process of that, okay, it's okay that I can't do something. I can go through this process of learning and developing, and now I can do it. And just that's called a mastery experience. Just having that experience tells you that you can. And a lot of children don't get those experiences. And then just the research that's coming out about how one positive role model in disadvantaged child's life can make all the difference. It really just takes one person to make them feel like they're okay, one person to make them feel like they're cared about. So I had a question here, just how, maybe you're a little more sensitive to how this might relate to a volunteer advocate as compared to a teacher. What ways that any of these things, maybe your experiences doing some of these things, or some things that you do that you see up here?
I think one of the most important things is that we see kids as they are, because our kids are forced to recreate themselves all the time. And so for us to acknowledge who they are, what their likes, dislikes, personality is really important. Yeah,
that's a really good point. And I think as they get older, that's more and more important, especially when and one of the challenges with dealing with this demographic of children is that too often they're forced to a more advanced stage. And again, in that use it or lose it sense, it's too late now. They're already kind of been forced to take on these responsibilities and identity. And so to kind of pull things back and try to give them that childhood experience or that space where they can learn and grow and things like that can be really difficult. But I think what you're saying is really that, especially that identity development through adolescence. And one of the things too is a recognition that that's okay, that you're not in concrete, like that you as a person can grow and change and be different and things like that. That's one of the positive things about the internet. Some people would say that it gives us an opportunity to really explore different identities and different ideas in a much safer way than maybe real life. And that, of course, has caveats because there can be some real dangers on the internet as well. But just that ability to, develop that identity and be comfortable knowing that that can change as well. Really, I'm mainly interested in, how maybe you, like some practical things that you do, or see in yourself doing.
Well, I've got when we lived in Katy before we retired here to Tyler, I was involved. It was a junior high, and also at the Katy Independent School District had this mentoring program.
Right.
You spend an hour a week with a kid, and so you sign up. And most of the kids, they were raised by a single mom. And in one case, this young man had been abused. He was a 7th grader. So anyway, his name was Josh, and I said, I'll be his mentor. And I remember we started off, in September, and all I did was I just would bring him a McDonald's hamburger at lunch, and we would play checkers and chess and just talk about his music, if he liked music. That's all I did. I just would show up and just be there for him. And we just, didn't talk about anything that, just about life and stuff like that. How's your day going? And so at the end of the year, I remember it was in May. I just said, Josh, I said, so tell me about who was your favorite teacher? What was your favorite thing? Just what was a real positive for you this year? And the answer, he said, you. I said, well, no, you didn't understand the question, but, and he said it again. He said, you were. And I think that was a defining moment for me. Like, man, all I did was show up and listen and be his friend. And I was I was kind of the center of his universe for that school year. And I thought, so I think at that point, that's when I realized that I can make a difference in these kids' lives. And it doesn't, all you got to do is kind of be yourself, be a positive role model, listen to them, show up when you say you're going to be there. And I thought, I think I can do this. So of course it's involved in the CASA that the stakes are a little higher and the kids are a little bit more difficult, but you have to show that you do like them. I think, what Amy said about, these kids are always being asked to change and to do things and we don't try to change them. We just do advocates for them.
Yeah.
And of course, we do change them positively. It doesn't take a lot sometimes, but it's fulfilling to see. Where, it's always nice to hear the words, or sometimes you'll never hear those words.
Yeah.
And but knowing that you're just doing the right thing for these kids.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. And in my, as a psychologist, I interpret that as that's the message they're getting from that is just that they're valuable, that they're worth something, that somebody cares about me, and they're internalizing that. And
one thing I think is common for children that grow up with these issues and have the higher scores, is they have learned how to adapt. And they're very good at adapting to just about any situation. They have a face for each one of those. Even to the point that maybe somewhere in that mix, they're not really sure who they are.
Right. Because
they mold themselves in different ways depending on the situation. Not that that's not completely completely abnormal. I think everybody does that to a small degree.
Yeah.
But, I think that when kids grow up, like some of the kids we deal with grow up, it's more of an extreme.
Yeah.
To do that. And I don't necessarily know how that fits into this thing, but it makes it really hard sometimes, I think, to recognize.
Yeah.
Who you're actually dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think, I see that. Yeah. There's just as a coping mechanism, survival, you do that. And I think like you said too, we all do it in what would be considered a typical and healthy way. And then you have those situations, especially during adolescence, again, when they're starting to solidify that identity and what they really believe and things like that. It could be a good time for some interventions. And I wonder if just, and I'm hesitant to say this because again, I'm not a counseling psychologist, but just, talking to them about that stuff, in general conversation, kind of trying to get at, what they actually like. And a lot of it could be, aspirational, like who do you see yourself as and what do you want to be? What do you want to do? Things like that. Helping them form that in a positive sense. And then two, there's there is research too on really, really top performers in terms of all areas. So like if you look at like top performers in like the CIA or like super high level positions and things like that, it's actually pretty common to have a relatively adverse childhood. And so one thing to recognize too is that all of this stuff that they're going through, it's not it's not a foregone conclusion that that there's going to be difficulties for the rest of their lives. They can turn those things into positive things and skills that they can really use in helping themselves, helping other people, and becoming a positive role model in society. So I think, recognizing that too, that they're kind of, if you see it as this kind of forge where they're being really, challenged, they could, in the right environment with the right interventions, can be a real positive in their life going forward. It has a hardening effect that we're more resilient, things like that. But it's a super fine line, because if it falls apart, it falls apart.
I do have a question, and I'm not sure if you're going to go over this or not, but during our pre-service training, so we do go over ACEs and we kind of go over this list of questions. And what I'm always telling people is like, we're not going to print this out, and drive over to the parents' house or the kid's house and be like, let's go over this list and find out your ACE score. Like, so we're not going to do that. We have to do it in a really discreet way to gather that information.
Yeah.
But I've noticed that whenever people try to go and try to research the ACE questions, there's a ton of options online.
Mhm.
Do you have any suggestions for?
I don't. I did find one related to like stress and, just in general, how the ACEs influence stress levels and then development, things like that, with some practical advice. So I can't remember who put it out, but I will, you have the PowerPoint, but I can send that to you too.
Okay.
That one, I think at the end of it has an activity for them. It's just a little, like it's a thermometer, it's a stress thermometer that they can, you choose something from life and then how does that influence your stress levels? Is it low, medium, or high? And then, getting them to talk about how do you feel when you're at that high stress level? What does it do to your head? What does it do to your belly? How does it make you feel? Things like that. So I think a lot of it, so yeah, in that regard, being aware of ACEs in their life, exactly what they are. So knowing, because they're different and they're very different. So being aware of exactly which ones this child might be dealing with, and then that social emotional development, getting them to put words to it and be able to talk about it. So you don't, like you said, you probably don't want to, it's not going to be in your face, sit down with the parents and we're going to talk about this now. But if you can find gentle ways to, let's talk about when, your parents got divorced, and let's talk about how that made you feel and things like that. Again, I don't know if that's appropriate for you to do that. It would kind of be case by case. You got to feel it out. I'm not a counselor. I'd be very, careful in how I do it, but I think there's a place for that. So yeah, being fully aware of which ones they're exactly going through, helping them to recognize that that's not typical, that that's something in their life that is a challenge, and we can talk about it and we can start developing, an understanding of how that made you feel and how we can address those feelings and move forward and things like that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
See, I bet something in the chat. So somebody mentioned that they have a 13-year-old that they advocate for, and they tend to tell very exaggerated stories of things that may or may not have occurred in their life. Is this something that goes hand in hand with adverse experiences?
It's a good question. I could see how it would, and again, my tendency is to put it back to shame and guilt. So it's a response to either feeling inadequate. So it's kind of like my stories aren't good enough, or I'm not good enough, or I feel that this, is a better, because they could be really just kind of thinking, in their minds, this exaggerated story now justifies something or that. And so, yeah, I think it kind of, again, goes back to those feelings of shame and guilt, and maybe in addressing it, it starts with just building up from the ground up that self-esteem and that you're okay the way you are. And right now, right here, you're okay. And from there, I think, yeah, building on that. And but that's a tough one. Because it puts everyone in a challenging situation, because at one time, on the one hand, eventually they might say something that you just know is exaggerated, like that did not happen. But there's going to be plenty of things that you can't be sure about. So you don't want to invalidate their experience. You don't want to make them feel like you don't believe them. While at the same time, you're trying to foster all those, just personal responsibility, being honest, and, things like that. So I think a lot of that could be too, just a lot of that could be determined from day one, first impressions, with you and that kid, and starting to develop that sense that they can trust you and be honest. And again, and I can imagine situations where it would be appropriate to just call them out, just like, hey, I know that didn't happen. Don't let's stop that. And that. So that might be appropriate too. that's about my time. I don't, I do, the last time I spoke here, I talked on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so that'll be in the PowerPoint that I sent to you all, but you know, it relates somewhat, but other than that, that's all I have for you.